Yes, Dr. Inhorn, it is lovely to see you again. Thank you so much for chatting about your book, Motherhood on Ice.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be here today.
Yes, this is such an important conversation. I just wanted to introduce you a little bit. You are the William K. Lanman Jr. Professor of Anthropology and International Affairs at Yale University. And you've written this book, which launched last year, correct?
Yes, in May 2023, the book
So
came out. Yeah.
still relatively new. I'm not sure everyone knows about it, so that's why we're talking about it today. Motherhood on Ice, the mating gap, and why women freeze their eggs. And it is just, I get chills saying that because it's so exciting to me that you produce this book because it's on real stories. Women that told, their personal story, and it really is the truth about egg freezing, where I feel like there's just so many conversations about egg freezing through the media, and we could go on, but you really delivered the truth about it. I just wanted to say, do you mind sharing a little bit of a background just on yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a medical anthropologist, which is an anthropologist who works with real people. We do interviewing, in-depth kind of what we call ethnographic interviewing with people. And so in this study, most of the research that I have done, by the way, I'm an anthropologist of reproduction, and I've mostly worked in the Middle East for a very long time, about 3 decades. But this technology, egg freezing, officially known as oocyte cryopreservation, came into being. The experimental label was lifted in late 2012. And one of my dear colleagues at the Yale Fertility Center said, Marcia, there's a new technology coming down the pike, and we should really figure out what women would be motivated to use egg freezing, to freeze their eggs in time, as it were. And so I wrote a grant proposal in 2013 to the US National Science Foundation, and I won a grant to do a major study of women who had frozen their eggs or were freezing their eggs. And I ended up interviewing 150 American women who had already frozen their eggs. So they were ones who had done it. 114 of them were healthy women, what we would call non-medical egg freezing. And then 36 of them were doing this for medical egg freezing for medical reasons, usually young women with cancer, which is a sort of different story. But actually, that was one of the original reasons that egg freezing was developed, to help young women facing dire medical conditions sort of preserve their fertility. But then it was made available in late 2012 to women who didn't have medical diagnoses. And it was the big question, why would women turn to egg freezing? It is an expensive technology. In the US, the average cost right now is about 16,000 US dollars for one cycle of egg freezing. So it's costly, and clearly, not everybody can access it, which is an issue in and of itself. But the study was really about, what are the motivations and experiences of American women who have decided to freeze their eggs.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I'm so glad you did it at the time that you did, because it was, women were coming to it because they wanted to, but for a number of reasons, as your book lays out. And so women that talked to you, they pretty much did that on their own, correct? Like, how did you find these women? Just curious.
Yeah, I basically recruited women through 4 different IVF centers, 2 of them academic centers, 2 of them private centers, and a flyer was sent out to women who had frozen their eggs. And so it was on a voluntary basis. They had to volunteer to be in touch with me. And there was a massive volunteerism. A lot of women contacted me. I mean, it was really amazing, and very generous, research generosity. I have to really thank all those women who agreed to speak with me. And so, yeah, over time, I met with 150 women who had done it, and I also talked to some women who were thinking about it or were in the process of it. but the book really focuses on the 150 who had done it. And the book mostly focuses on the 114 women who were doing it for non-medical reasons, because that is the major reason now why women are freezing their eggs. We could call it elective or non-medical or social egg freezing, a term that most women didn't like. They didn't like the idea of social egg freezing because this isn't really a fun procedure. It's not really done socially, although there are, as we're going to talk about, deep underlying social reasons, societal reasons why women are freezing their eggs.
Yes, and that's why I also think this book is so important, because it really tells the women's story of why they're freezing their eggs, and not what media labeled it, to push out articles or news on it. So like social egg freezing. And what's beautiful about this book is all the stories you share. So I really feel like if anyone is interested in egg freezing, or just like has heard about it or curious as to why women do it, they could relate to at least one story that you share in this book. And I will say, I think most people's names were changed a little bit, right, to protect people. But are there any stories that stuck with you the most?
Yeah, so yeah, the book is really full of stories. And I think if you're right, if anything, I think that people reading it will say, oh, I know somebody like that, or oh, that's just like me. I mean, I've actually had women writing to me after the book came out saying, oh my God, you told my story. I'm in this situation. What is the situation for most women? And so what was the story? It's that 82% of women, when they froze their eggs, were partnerless, single, either because they had not had a partner recently or they had been in a relationship that had broken up. It's really a story of women not being able to find reproductive partners, stable, heterosexual, straight, male partners, for the most part. That is the big story. So I start the book actually with the prologue of a woman I call Kayla, who I thought was, pretty typical of the women I was seeing. She was in her late 30s at the time she froze her eggs. In my study, the average age at the time of egg freezing was 36.6 years. So these are women on the mid to late 30s of their lives. And why are they doing it then? It's because they're successful professional women. So the big story about egg freezing was that it was going to be about educational and career planning for young women, doing this in a sort of intentional way. And that's really not the story of egg freezing, at least now. It's women who are already educated, they're already entrenched in good careers, and they've been looking for a partner along the way, often since their 20s, and haven't been able to find the right reproductive partner. And that was the story for Kayla. She was a very successful person. She ended up working in tech in Silicon Valley, a place where I interviewed quite a few women. And, she came from a family. She had three brothers. They were married. She had done really well. She got to her mid 30s and she said, I have all these male friends and I go on dates with men, but it's just not turning into a relationship. And she had in California dated two men. The first man, was what she called kind of a type B surfer dude. He was fun. They would go skiing and so on. And he actually helped her do her egg freezing. But she realized after she froze her eggs with him that he had no intention of partnering with her and using those eggs. It was really clear to her that he didn't have any intention of being her long-term reproductive partner. So she sadly broke up with him. She went back on the dating market. She found another man and was very enthusiastic because he was divorced and said, oh, I definitely want to have children. I didn't do that with my relationship. He was unfaithful in his relationship. But I do want to have children. And, he strung her along again. He and his friends, it talks about sort of their attitudes toward women as they age. And it really made her very stressed out. So she was with him at the time that I interviewed her. But, a lot of the women in my study followed up with me some years later. And so I, had a follow up with Kayla. She ended up moving to a different place and she was 45 years old. She had frozen her eggs, back in California, and she was still not partnered. And she said, it's just the mystery of my life. I couldn't find this partner. And so most women who are freezing their eggs is because they're partnerless. And I ended up calling it the mating gap. Women's inability to find what I called, the three E's, a lack of eligible, educated, equal partners. And we might add enthusiastic or eager men who wanted to be in a partnership and have children with a woman. And so then you have to ask, like, why? Why would somebody like Kayla, very attractive, educated, funny, talkative, eloquent person, be in this situation? And that's where in the book I really get to the underlying demography of this, which has to do with the fact that women are just soaring educationally in our country, and actually in more than 60% of the countries around the world, women are now outperforming men educationally. Many women are getting college degrees, and often post-bachelor's degrees. Like 80% of the women in my study had either a master's degree or an MD, PhD, JD. Women are doing really well educationally, and actually now they're doing better than men. In the United States, there are 27% more women in higher education than there are men. And actually, it leaves millions of women like Kayla in the sort of prime reproductive years between, say, 22 and 39, millions more of them in ready to mate, if you will. But there are millions more of them who are educated than there are educated American men. So that's a huge issue. And then another story I do want to point out, which was another big issue, was just the men leaving women or women leaving men. I called it the end of romance, and something we don't really talk very much about in egg freezing. But a lot of women are doing it after a major traumatic, a relationship trauma, if you will, where they end up in a broken engagement or the breakup of a long-term relationship with somebody or the breakup of a relationship where the man betrayed the woman for some reason. And in that chapter of the book, it was a pretty heartbreaking story of a woman I call Lily, who had really hung in there with the man she loved. I called him Jack. And he kept holding out this promise of, like, yeah, in the future, I can see myself, having children. I can see it, but I'm not ready right now. The unready man was a major theme. Men who are unready. She hung in with him because she loved him. She really felt, and actually still did at the end of the day, feel that he had been her soulmate, the one that she really thought she would spend her life with. She hung in for 10 years. Finally, they took a trip together to Europe. And she said, I always had hoped to go off birth control with him, in a mutual decision, but he would never do it. And so she did it on her own. And then he wouldn't sleep with her for 18 months. He was really upset and didn't want to have sex with her because he didn't want to make a baby with her. And finally, at age 40, she said, I can't take it anymore. He's never going to really commit to me. And so that was a very sad story. And then by the time she froze her eggs in her early 40s, she did freeze eggs, but ultimately they weren't viable, because in your early 40s, your chances of actually conceiving are extremely low. And women don't really understand that. That was one of the huge issues in my book. Women are not well educated about their fertility and their fertility decline. But I think I want to end with a happy story because, I tried to show the spectrum of things that happen, that women never find a partner, women break up from partners. There's some stories of women who froze their eggs and didn't find a partner, but just said, to heck with it, I'm going to do it on my own, which is called single motherhood by choice. Although we really could call it single motherhood by circumstance, because a lot of women really aren't choosing to do this on their own. But anyway, I have some of those successful stories in the book. The final chapter, I sort of talk about outcomes, and I feature a woman who I called Hannah, um, and a man who I called Lucas. They met on a very, very long bike ride across a continent. And she had what you would call like the most elite advanced education from the Ivy League. She was Ivy League educated. And she met him. He was like a Western guy. He was a Western firefighter. He had some state college, but they were on sort of different educational levels and from very different places in life, but they totally fell in love. They got, finished the bike ride, and he packed up his house and his puppy, his dog, and moved across country to be with Hannah. And I can tell you, because I've very recently heard from Hannah, they're 10 years in, they've got two children, including their frozen egg baby. They had a first child naturally, quite by surprise, and then they used the frozen eggs to make their second child. So, there are all kinds of stories in this book. And I think the story is really for women who find themselves in this situation of being partnerless, and really criticizing themselves or blaming themselves for their situation. I think my book really will help women like that to realize you are so not alone. This is not an individual problem that women, that they did something wrong, were too picky, had chose the wrong person or whatever. This is about some basic issues in heterosexual gender relations, partnership relations right now. Things are going a bit awry. And, the book is really, I mean, I'm a feminist scholar. And so the book really talks about some of the gender issues that, educated, successful professional women in our country are facing, unfortunately.
Yes. And that's what I just appreciate, that there's so much, research backed to, have this conversation that your book brings up. So one thing you mentioned about was the self-blame. And so in your book, you have, and I, based on all these conversations, you created like beautiful categories where I do believe sometimes people, women, even that I know, might feel alone in this process, but because of the categories that you've created, based on all these conversations, they can identify, with at least something in one of the categories. Like, so I just wondered if you could talk about some of them. Like, for example, the one that I first read about was the women's gender laments. Self-blame is in there, women having too high of expectations, what you're talking about, like men's lower commitments, and then missing men. That one really stuck out to me. I mean, they all kind of did for their own, various ways, but I don't know if there was just a little bit more you could talk about the categories that you create in this book. And how you kind of came up with that, and if there was other like themes or anything you can share about that.
Yeah, I first want to say that I think this book, I think its major contribution, if you will, is to take us away from this idea that egg freezing is all about women career planning, doing this very intentional kind of thing to defer, delay, and postpone their fertility, as if women, and then they're seen as sort of selfish career women. And I must note, do we have a category of career men? No, we don't. It's like women aren't supposed to have careers or ambitions or something like that. But that was a lot of the rhetoric. And actually, when I went into the study, I assumed that egg freezing was about women intentionally deferring, delaying, postponing for careers and education. But I kept like the alternative hypothesis in there. Well, it could be about other things. And honestly, within the first 10 interviews, it was so not about career planning or, it was about, I don't have a partner. I'm single, single, single. And so, and with that came these very sad sort of feelings of self. Women were criticizing themselves, like, "Ugh, I didn't put enough effort into online dating." I mean, almost everybody had done online dating. It was considered torture, a second job. There a lot of complaint about just the exhaustion of it and how it hadn't really worked for many women. Oh, maybe I should have stayed with my college boyfriend, or I'm too picky. My friends say I'm not picky. They think I'm not judgmental, but maybe I'm too. So there was all this self-questioning, which I think is wrong, So women, I really tried to say this isn't about women being somehow did something wrong here, right? But we do need to talk about gender norms in American society. And women were very thoughtful and reflective about that. They said, we are of the generation sort of where our moms were maybe, coming out of second wave feminism, if you will. Our moms and dads told us, like, go for it, pursue a, career that you're happy with. And you should have gender equality at work and at home. This is something that women of your generation should be able to achieve. So women believed in gender equality and they wanted it at work, but they also wanted to find a kind of equal guy. And they said, maybe our expectations now for a good relationship are a bit different, a bit higher than like our parents' generation. We want like a soulmate. We want somebody who loves us, who understands us, who feels equal to us in their aspirations and goals. We want, an equal partner, truly equal. But what they were finding is that, these were women for the most part who were maybe the most highly educated you could find in terms of women. These were very educated women. And to some extent, like, how are they going to find an equal guy who's like them? And in traditional gender norms, not only in the US, but really around the world, Traditionally, women are sort of expected to engage in something in anthropology that we call hypergamy, marrying up. And you'll see, like, women often choose somebody slightly older, somebody who maybe makes more money, who has a more established career. The idea that the man is supposed to be sort of the breadwinner for the family, this notion that women are supposed to find somebody higher than them, if you will. And for women who are already very accomplished, like, are you going to find somebody higher or even equal? Women were having trouble with that, I'm going to tell you. Men, meanwhile, traditionally around the world, are expected to engage in hypogamy, marrying down, someone slightly younger or very much younger, somebody who's fertile, and women talked about that. Men, like, they don't want to be with a 36-year-old woman. They want to be with a 30 something or even a late 20 something. So ageism, so men are looking for younger, fertile, and not necessarily a very accomplished woman, because men are expected to, take care of the family finances, right? And so these are old, I'm going to say retrogressive gender norms, but they seem to be alive and well, because women said, it's like, I don't try to, like, boast about my accomplishments. I'm not an intimidating person. I don't think I'm an intimidating person, but I'll tell you, when I go out with men, I really feel they're intimidated. They're kind of emasculated. They, sometimes when I tell them where I work, they'll go, "Oh, you're smarter than I am." If I invite them over to my apartment or my condo, or they see my car, "Oh, wow, you make more money than I do." Really, like, overt comments like that. There were a lot of stories of things that men said to women. And so women ended up telling me, like, these different categories of men that they encountered. I think it's one of the sort of, if I hesitate to say, most humorous tables in my book. It's called 10 Types of Men, A Woman's Lexicon, where they talked about the different kinds of men: the alpha males, the beta males, the feminist men, the foreign service men, which I have to laugh at because those men are Yale, pale, and male. I'm at Yale, but, white, sort of conservative guys, right?
Yes.
And then, the big one category, this term that I hadn't really heard when I started talking to women, the Peter Pan men, which was sort of all the women in big cities told me about these men who might actually be educated guys with money, and they will wine and dine you, and act like you're having a lot of fun and like there's potentially going to be a commitment. But women said you could hang in with one of those guys waiting for him to sort of settle down with you. He has no intention of settle. He's a guy who never wants to grow up. He's going to keep playing the field. And if you really hang in with him, it's a time waster, because, you'll be sorely disappointed in the end. And they said, you encounter these kinds of men who just, they're a lot of fun to go out with, but don't count on them ever really wanting to partner with you. And Kayla, in the prologue of my book, really encountered those kind of men in Silicon Valley because they have many options, right? So, the sort of mismatch in gender norms, and sort of like, what do men want? Do they want a partner? Do they want love? Do they want to be dads? And I guess I have to say the limitation of my study is I didn't interview any men. The views of men in my book are really through women's eyes, if you will. But since there was such strong themes sort of across all the women that I talked to about meeting these kinds of men who were unready, didn't really want a partner, were like very wishy-washy about that. It suggests that a lot of men are really questioning fatherhood, or being in a long-term monogamous relationship. And women said, look, that's a right that men have. I have a lot of male friends. They're in their late 30s, early 40s. They're great guys, but they have no intention of partnering. They have other life goals. They want to travel, they want to do sports, they want to do their careers. Partnership isn't a priority for them. So that really showed up. I mean, beyond the 82% of women in my study who froze while single, there were 18% who did have a partner at the time of egg freezing, but half of those, so 9%, were very unstable, relationships. When women, it was either very new, or women, it was shaky. They knew it was shaky. Women didn't know if it was going to continue. And there were instances in that group where men literally froze the eggs with the woman and then dumped them like the day or two after, like this was the red line, I'm not going to stay with you. And then there were 9% in that total of women who felt they were in a stable relationship. They felt they were stably partnered, but the man was unready, and they froze their eggs because they were like waiting for the man to be ready. So this theme of, why aren't men ready? It's just something we need to be researching. We need to be looking at men and their reproductive aspirations and goals, because clearly for both men and women, things are changing. And this technology can't fix the sort of what you might call gender gap or the mating gap, the sort of mismatch between what women want and maybe what men want. Women who freeze their eggs, generally speaking, they want what I call the three Ps. They want partnership, pregnancy. They want to experience pregnancy with their own eggs, and they want parenthood. They want to be moms. I mean, you really wouldn't go through this very expensive, invasive procedure if you weren't holding out the hope of being a mom, motherhood. And so that's the sort of sadness of it. You want to be a mom, but you can't find a stable reproductive partner to do this with you. And so then you have to think of plan B, which is, do I do it on my own? And I talked to almost, not every woman about that, but most women wanted to talk about thinking at least about, could I afford it? Could I do it? Do I have enough support to do it? That was a kind of discussion that a lot of women, they were already thinking about it. A few had done it already. And some decided that they just couldn't do it, or they didn't want to do it, that they'd always wanted to parent with a partner. And
Yeah.
we're holding out really,
Yeah.
hope of this.
For sure. Yeah. And it really speaks to the point that women have to make that decision. It's sort of, they, I don't know, that a lot lies on the woman, to freeze their eggs, to have this possibility later in life, because of, yeah, just not finding a partner because of all the reasons you're sharing. So, it's really just sort of refreshing, I think, to see it all and hear about it all. And not that we want to hear, these struggles, but for someone that's questioning, like, why does their life look like this? It's reassuring that, okay, I'm not the only one, like we talked about earlier.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's the biggest takeaway for women who are feeling like, what did I do? Or I'm in my early 30s, any kind of panic, read the book. I mean, it'll make you feel that you're not alone. You'll
Yeah,
identify with people in this book. And I do share stories that were successful. I mean,
right.
egg freezing is not an insurance policy. It doesn't always work. And there's some stories about that in the book, but it is sometimes successful for people who go back to rewarm and have the eggs fertilized. And so we need to think about that too.
Exactly. And so I think, one of our last questions here is that, or talking points, I should say, is like one of the categories you pointed out was the benefits of egg freezing and a women's lexicon of positive assessments. And so I really liked this because I think there were about 11 categories, and empowerment, which like we talked about earlier, was the thought of reason why women would do this, was only one category of 11, positive assessments for egg freezing. And it wasn't even the largest category um, in your table. And so I appreciated that because, that is a benefit, but it's not the driver, of this, of why women do it right now. And so you had some interesting stories, and I don't know if you want to just talk about that category and table, or I liked one of your stories, like someone flew you out to LA because, they were producing, I think, a film now based on what they went through, or something like that. And so there are really, I would say, maybe unforeseen, like positive, things that come out of egg freezing and personal experiences. And I just didn't know if you could share about anything around that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important just to look at the positives of it. What does it do for women? I will say that at first, egg freezing was sort of held up as this revolutionary technology. It's going to be as revolutionary as the birth control pill. All women are eventually going to use it. And sometimes you still hear that rhetoric. I mean, 10 years on, it's still out there. And, is it as revolutionary as the birth control pill? I'm going to say no, because it is so expensive. I mean, this is something we need to talk about. The downside of egg freezing is that it's extremely expensive. You also have to go through it. It's not an easy experience. I think women who do it are very brave because you have to learn to self-inject powerful hormones into your body. You have to go through a surgical procedure. It's a month of your life. Sometimes you don't feel good going through it. It's not easy. And so I don't think we should just say, egg freezing, you go to the clinic and get your eggs taken out. No, it's a big procedure, right? And it's costly. And so, that's a big downside is just the expense and the difficulty of the procedure. But, I asked women at the end of my interviews with them, I asked almost everybody two questions. Well, now that you've done it, how do you feel? And there was this outpouring of positive sentiment. More than 90%, I think it was something like 93% of women had at least one positive thing to say about it, and often much happiness that they had done it. And there were these 11 categories. I'm going to say women did use the empowerment word, just they said, I felt so empowered, wildly and weirdly empowered. But there were many other things. It was a pressure valve, a huge release of this feeling of pressure that they had, the sort of ticking of the biological clock. They felt that it did give them more time. It was a time extender. It gave people a sense of sort of technological optimism, like, well, there's this technology here. It might work for me. The sense that women often said, like, in a situation that was out of my control, like I can't control finding a partner, but it did give me this sense that I could control the one thing that I could control at the time, which was to do this. You know, uh, People did use insurance, like it felt like they had given themselves a safety net. So there were so many sort of positive things. I have a list of well over 200 little positive quotes, things that women said positively about egg freezing. So I created this big table, okay? And so it did give women a sense of relief. I mean, just profound relief that they had done something that they could to try to preserve in time the eggs at the age that they froze them and give them this ability to extend. I called it kind of like a reproductive suspension bridge, bridging this mating gap. And for women who were single, it was about like giving them time, hopefully, to find the partner, to find love, and to find the partner. And so, I do sort of highlight this story of Hannah and Lucas who did find each other. It does happen for some women. So that's really important. And I think it's important for a couple of reasons to talk about that. Also, just preventing regret. That was another thing. Like, I don't want to regret. I did what I could so that I don't feel regret that I didn't try my best. But there have been a lot of media stories, I have to say, over the decade about women who did it and then it didn't work and then they regretted. So it's important to talk about that. And I have one story in my book, an important story about a woman who froze 25 eggs, which is more than sort of the recommended guideline. And yet when she went back to use them with a partner, she found a partner, none of the frozen eggs worked. So sometimes it doesn't work. And she said, it was not the insurance policy that I thought it was. And so you cannot count on those eggs. I mean, we have to emphasize that it's not a foolproof 100% insurance policy, but it does work for many women, right? If they go back. The problem is a lot of women haven't gone back. And what do we know about why women haven't gone back? It's often because they haven't found that partner, So women need to think about using eggs on their own. I mean, women really need to contemplate, is that a reason to do egg freezing with the potential of using those eggs and becoming a single mom? And we do have a lot of good research on single moms with donor offspring who are doing very well. Okay. Um, and I also, at the end, based on my own life experience, at the end, sort of talk to women about, like, maybe we need to rethink a mate. Who is going to be the mate? Maybe you need to sort of like rethink who you're looking for. And, in the prologue, I actually talk about my own story. I was divorced in a very difficult, I had been married in my 20s. I was divorced in my early 30s. I was finishing graduate school. I was single and I knew I wanted children, and I contemplated maybe I'll just go to the sperm bank and use donor sperm and have children on my own. And then I did meet my partner. He had dropped out of college, in California. He was sort of that age, and when people were doing that a lot. And he was going back to school, and I could tell he was really kind and intelligent. He had never thought about having kids. But I said, that's mandatory for me. So he's like, well, I'm not opposed to it. Anyway, 33 years on and two kids later, we're together, and he went back to school. He actually did over his undergraduate degree, got a master's degree. So it was a different timeline than mine. But, I married somebody who hadn't completed college. He was a college dropout. So I sort of at the end, my colleague, John Berger, who wrote a great book called Datanomics, The Lopsided Numbers Game in Dating, really pointed out how women are at a disadvantage here because of educational disparities. He called this mixed collar dating, women who are educated contemplating being with a man who's not as educated. And that's what I did. And I talked about that at the end of the book. I think women are going to, because there are millions fewer educated men, women are going to have to recast the notion of who might be a great mate. And, there are kind, loving men out there who maybe don't have, a master's degree or whatever, who could be a great mate. So that was one of the things at the end I sort of talked about. Like, what can you do if you're in this
Yes.
situation?
Yes. Well, fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. And just thank you for putting this book out there because it's just so important, I think, for women to, many women to read. And I know it will resonate with so many more. So thank you for your time. And I would just say, is there anything else that you want to make sure if we didn't touch on, we chatted about now, if there's like one main takeaway, which I think we've already discussed, but anything else that you wanted to comment on?
Yeah, I think I just want to say, women who've done egg freeze are contemplating it. I really want to applaud women for being brave and courageous to take this move. It's not an easy decision to make for most women. It is costs a lot of money. And so it's something that requires courage. And, I really have to say, I also appreciated the incredible candor and courage of the 150 women who talked to me about really in-depth stories about their lives, their motivations, and their experiences. So I say thank you to everybody all the people in this book. The names and identifying characteristics have been changed a bit, but the book is chock full of stories, and I hope they will resonate with readers. So I thank you so much for talking with
Yes.
me about this book.
Thank you so much. And everyone should go get a copy. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.